In the first 5 chapters, we saw Fall get to grips with being an adventurer. In these 5 chapters, he's starting to learn about the wider world around his home. Please enjoy. I couldn't sleep when I arrived back from Oak Island. My excitement to build the cartography suite overcame my exhaustion, and Two Bones' relentless enthusiasm made me forget about the ache in my shoulders that I had earned from spending the last few days chopping down trees, digging up sand, and rowing to the mainland. In my drowsy stupor, I ran around like a headless chicken, bouncing between different chests and barrels as I stored the resources I'd gathered, as well as refitting my equipment and staring at the excavated room below the bunker. My mind swirled with ideas for designs, and weariness led me to throw caution to the wind as I dived headfirst into my task. Sometimes it's easy to get hung up on a plan, and it's better to just crack on. From Two Bones' loppy smile, I suspected that was his way of dealing with things too. After finishing the basics of the staircase, tiredness caught up with me. As I wiped the sleep from my eyes, Two Bones' wagging tail greeted me. I couldn't help but smile and told him how nice it was to receive such a warm good morning. I fear that may have upset Nellie, because her normal helpful demeanour was blunted. My attention for Two Bone only grew as he chased away a skeleton wielding an enchanted bow that was lurking just outside. After watching the over-exaggerated praise I showered on Two Bone, Nellie had had enough, and she thumped me as she zoomed back into my pocket to nap, rather than hover around as usual to see what I was doing. I was lucky she hadn't aimed for my head, as I still hadn't replaced the helmet I'd lost in Copperwater Cave. For the time being, I wouldn't have to rely on her recipes, as it was time for some construction. I started with the long overdue fortification of the bunker windows. I didn't want to remove the flower pot, but after reflecting on the gang of little zombies that sallied in through the opening, I installed the remainder of the bars. Then, instead of outfitting the farmhouse as crudely, I used glass panes and even made a second lower window that made the kitchen a tad less dreary. With that, I felt ready to turn my attention to the cartography suite and viewing platform. Two Bone helped, or rather he tried to, as I extended the bunker's foundations and built the staircase. As I dug into the stone, I was reminded again of how rich in resources the rocky plateau was, whereupon my home sat. With oak and stone, the room started to take form. I took breaks to reap the produce of the farm and replant the dandelion in the plant pot on my copper bedside table. Nellie loved decorating, and I noticed her peering out of my pocket. I wished I could put some of the maps up on the wall, but only had a single piece of leather to make the frames. I would need to find a way to get more. Reserving that and other plans for later, I continued to work on the room structure. My heart sat in my stomach as I got to working on the window. I could look over the edge of the cliff face without too much anxiety, but I didn't appreciate Two Bone buffeting me as he bounded about. The sturdy wooden beams and thick blocks of glass made the viewing platform strong, and it felt good to look out towards the sea within the comfort and safety of my expanding home, even at night. Not realising how stubborn Nellie could be, I made the first step in making up. Coaxing her back around wasn't too difficult, as I loftily raised the idea of refitting the kitchen, if only I knew how to make a cauldron or a smoker. In the end, we made both. Whilst refurnishing the kitchen, I introduced Two Bone to fish. Her elegance clashed with the wolf's boisterousness, but they seemed to get on. I hadn't seen guests around, so it was good for fish to get some company. With all the time and focus I'd put into my own home, I felt a pang of responsibility. With Two Bone around, the local animals had left my farm be. Whilst that meant that I had started to crew a small stockpile, it also meant that the animals might be going hungry, or at least relegated to chewing on grass. I expanded the hole in the hill to accommodate the animals, if they ever did want a place to shelter from the rain and the creatures of the night. However, even with the offering of hay bales, it still wasn't too inviting, although some were more easily impressed than others. Feeling pleased with my progress, I didn't hold back from grabbing a map and setting out to explore more of the world. I wanted to chart some of the area around Welcome Peak. I explained various things to Two-Bone as he trotted along by my side, or at least explained things at him. As I hopped along, I didn't realise how loud I was talking. So, when I told Two-Bone about the Grumpy Village, I hadn't noticed the two weaponsmiths standing within earshot. Not knowing if they'd overheard me, or if they were just behaving as they normally would, they actively ignored me. This small village was a smithing town, and the 4 residents were quite proud. Well, 3 of the 4 anyway. I felt shame as I attempted to climb up the slope of Welcome Peak. I put my foot in it again, except this time I had insulted my close neighbours. I barely looked at the map as I trundled over the steep terrain. This was hardly the way to paint my maps anyway, but I was distracted as I dwelt on my rudeness. My ruminations were interrupted as I turned the corner. My mouth was left partly open as I stared into the bowels of Welcome Peak. Even Two-Bone seemed shocked into silence. With my sense of exploration shaken, I turned around. But my head was clearer now, and I made my way back to the Grumpy Village. There I offered my apologies for getting off on the wrong foot, and as politely as I could, also offered to take a look at their current irrigation system. As charming as I tried to be, it was not my words that garnered a slither of their respect, but my willingness to traverse these lands at night. These people respected strength, and clearly had an underappreciation for farming, so agreed to let me see what I could do. That was something that would have to wait until daytime. I hadn't thought about it until now, but I had been feeling more confident to protect myself recently. That was another thing I had Two-Bone to thank for. Whilst previously I'd been the object of target practice for skeletons, with the wolf by my side, it felt like I was hunting the archers. And having food on me meant I was prepared to continue the fight. Following engagement after engagement, I stopped to look where I was, and wasn't quite sure. I dived headfirst in again, and forgotten I had a map. In doing so, missed my rocky plateau. They say that your character rubs off on your dog, or wolf, but it had seemed more like Two-Bone's behaviour was rubbing off on me. I started heading back the right way, but as I approached the brow of the hill, I spotted a cluster of monsters between me and my home. As I formed a plan to get around them safely, the heavens intervened and bathed the land in light. As I looked into the still unoccupied hole where the herd were welcome to stay, I thought about how sometimes it takes more than just good intentions to help those around you. But that was an excellent place to start. It wouldn't be long before I would start my small project for the Grumpy Village. That wasn't the actual name of their home, but I didn't know what their village was called. To prepare myself for returning there, I felt like I needed a shock to the system. The villages of the mountain respected the brave and the bold. That spark was somewhere inside me, and what I was about to do could ignite it. This was something that had been tempting me for a while now, but from Nellie's shivering vibrations, I knew she wasn't on board. Two-Bone would follow me anywhere, and I had to tell him to stay. Mustering all the patience he had, he did. Mustering all the courage I had, I jumped. My ears violently popped as I plunged into the water. Something was different. Distracted, I couldn't tell which direction I was facing, and flailing, blindly crashed through the surface to reprieve my lungs. I orientated myself and grabbed the kelp I had unintentionally farmed. When I had jumped, Nellie had slipped out of my pocket to stay with Two Bone. That was the first time she'd properly left my side. But then I saw. She was flying. I didn't know she could do that. I found a low ledge to haul myself onto underneath my home. I looked up and could see my viewing platform. It appeared small from here. As I scaled up the cliff, I considered the challenge that potential thieves would have from this approach. For now though, my challenge was the monsters. As usual, the zombies found me first, like they could smell me. The skeleton wasn't too far behind though, which baited me off the ledge I thought was keeping me safe. As I closed the distance with the skeleton, I found I had also closed the distance with a creeper. Not good. Instinct raised my shield, and I was grateful they were strong enough to block the creeper's blast. A good time to learn on the job. I scoped out an escape route and waited for an opening. That was a close enough call, as previously when I'd looked down here, I'd seen far more monsters in the chasm. I was lucky. The night wasn't done with me yet though, and a trio of zombies pushed my stone sword to breaking. I found my axe was a suitable replacement for now. Two Bone reacted like I'd been gone far longer than just the afternoon, and it seemed like he would have waited forever. I had proven my bravery to myself, although felt immensely more confident again with the wolf by my side. Before bed, I planted some of the kelp in Fish's pool, after learning it wasn't to my taste. The morning was filled with the sounds of the land and sky that I hadn't ever noticed before. Feeling at one with the plains, I dutifully waited for the acacia to drop their saplings. With a supply of wood, other building materials I'd taken from my chest, and a packed hamper, I was ready for my trip. When I arrived back at the grumpy village, I was greeted with the usual disparaging look and grunt, but ignored them and got to work like I had promised. It was clear that these people naturally held a grudge. Their willingness to engage with me, despite my previous rude attitude, betrayed a resilience that implied they were used to being disappointed. I wasn't from here, and knew next to nothing about the communities that inhabited these lands, or their relations with each other. All the more reason to show a propensity to be helpful and useful. By obstructing the flowing water with cobblestone, I had managed to at least dry up the puddle that had flooded half the village, but soon had to stop as my exhausted back pleaded for relief, and I took my breather near where some of the villagers had gathered. They never showed hostility, they mainly just ignored me. I asked if the two weaponsmiths were twins. They denied it, offended by my presumptions. No, they were triplets. Likely coming across more desperate than I intended to, I showed admiration with the combined skill the three of them had. But I had presumed again. The armoursmith was their cousin. No, their other brother was Fergus. After continuing my run of inadvertently insulting the locals, I refrained from casually suggesting if the cobblestone dam was acceptable, and instead got to replacing it with something more in keeping with the village's aesthetic. Nellie knew the recipe to mimic the way the villagers had fashioned the bark of the acacia trees into corners. As my hands touched the crafting table, Nellie's pages glowed, and her magic distorted my vision, tracing the perfect way to craft things I would otherwise have no idea how to make. What Nellie couldn't help with was the designing and building, which I fussed over. What direction should I place this grain of bark? Hopeless. I wasn't allowed to stay the night, so each day I travelled the short distance back and forth from home. Despite being such a short distance, I placed a waypoint to stop me getting disorientated in the night, and would later add a second one to stop me falling into the gorge. In the end, it was the day that proved more dangerous for me, as I encountered a skeleton armoured in enchanted golden armour that protected it from the sun. I thought I'd chased him off, but once again I had been outsmarted by a skeleton. I couldn't blame the grumpy village's lack of hospitality for that. worked for days at the village. My toy was broken up by fighting my way back home. I was starting to question my decision to help, but my mood was lifted when I found a carrot that was dropped by a little zombie. Reinvigorated, I pushed forward. On one of my morning walks back to the grumpy village, I saw an Enderman. My poor first impression of the strange creatures had been partly remedied on meeting guest, and I approached, wary of not making direct eye contact. I wondered aloud if they were guest, to which they responded by hijacking my mind's eye. That was something I'm not sure I could ever get used to, but it did work, and I was relieved I hadn't mistaken them for somebody else. I stood awkwardly, not really knowing what to say or do, and Guest was the first to break the silence by showing me a vision of Fish. Yes, I responded, Fish was still at home, and no, I didn't mind if they visited. To me, that seemed like the end of the conversation, if you could call it that, and their intense gaze followed me as I trotted off. On the southwest side of the village, I expanded the miniature dam into a modest reservoir, and even added a second well. I overheard a conversation between the locals about how things were much nicer since their boots were drier. With a few finishing touches, I was proud of my crude structure. When I spoke to the weaponsmith, he wasn't overly enthusiastic, but satisfied enough. That was when he told me that if I really wanted to show my friendship to the village, there was one more thing I had to do. I'd only offered to help with their irrigation, and was starting to feel like this might be more of a one-way friendship. He asked me to visit the nearby cave by his house, and bring back all the resources inside. I reminded myself of why I was here, and dutifully nodded. I steeled myself once more and entered the cave. There were no monsters in the opening, and I used the piece to smelt the iron I had already found, anticipating the need for sturdier equipment, and this way I'd at least garner something for myself whilst I was here. That proved unnecessary, as this was a very small cave. It was night when I exited out into the open air, but I wasn't going back home. I impatiently looked for the weaponsmith, and found one of his brothers playing in the reservoir. It seemed, whilst I had explored the cave, he had gone to bed, and after pretending to be asleep, got very upset with my interruption. He would speak to me in the morning. After all the running back and forth, I ended up sleeping here, just not where I would have wanted. In the morning, I was further irritated when I learnt that the weaponsmith knew exactly what was in the cave, and just wanted to test my bravery, which, he added, must be sufficient for me to go into the cave with my current equipment. Before I could retort, he invited me into his workshop and guided me to a chest where he told me to put what I had gathered, and to take the iron sword inside. I found the chest contained more than just a sword, and was surprised at the town's wealth when I saw 2 diamonds as well as a saddle. I popped the coal and iron inside, and took the sword. Nellie's look suggested her recipe would be much better, but the look I gave her stopped us from appearing ungrateful. I thanked them for their generosity and prepared to leave, when I was offered the chance to build a home here for when I was passing through. I tried to tell them that wasn't necessary, as I lived so close nearby, but they were oddly insistent. So I spent a few more days there. My hands were blistered from chopping down trees. Fortunately, the acacia grew quickly and I didn't have to wander far. Still, I looked longingly at the maps as the field section creeped forward with my step. One day I would get the chance to paint them. The painting in the house was an odd choice to finish it off, but the enchanted decoration was as persistent as the residence. I suppose it fitted in with the villagers' hard demeanour. Instead of being invited to stay another night, the villagers were once again insistent, only this time with their goodbyes. I wondered if I wouldn't be the only one staying in the new house. Since I had been here, I spent a bit of time tending to the crops and excitedly witnessed the growth of a watermelon, one of which the locals were kind enough to let me take. As I was leaving, I diplomatically remarked that they should take better care of their crops to maximise produce. And they not so diplomatically said I should take better care of my wolf. feed him zombie flesh. He'll like that. The villagers really seem to hate zombies, but they were right. I now realise that the people here could easily take my small insults on the chin, inadvertently or otherwise, and I had achieved what I came here for. When I got back to my own farm, I reflected that I may have been harbouring misplaced animosity towards the local fauna. In all likelihood, they never stole anything from me. The plants just needed care and attention to flourish. That was another thing I'd learned from the grumpy village. Aside from the new carrots and melons, I could be proud of the friends I had made, and the gift of the iron sword. Whilst the plains of the savannah provided ample food for the animals that grazed there, it was also sparse of trees, and the lack of hiding spots must make it dangerous at night when the giant spiders come out to hunt. I frequented the dirty slopes to collect chicken eggs, milk the cows, and shear the sheep there. Currently, my relationship with the herds was unilateral, and since I had realised that they probably weren't pilfering my crops, I thought it was only right that I try and provide something back. My previous 2 attempts hadn't received much attention, so, for the 3rd time, I got to working on the hole in the ground I had envisaged to be a safe place where the animals of the plains might want to stay. The merchant had come to visit me again, but as I approached him, I saw that he was being held hostage by a skeleton donned in leather armour that shielded it from the sun. Two-Bone and I leapt to the merchant's defence, but in my fervour I accidentally swiped Two-Bone with my new iron sword. Clearly I was still getting used to it. With the skeleton defeated, I completely ignored the merchant, instead giving Two-Bone a handful of zombie flesh and my sincerest apologies. The merchant could see that it was an accident, but was quick to comment on how I needed some practice in animal handling. I don't think he would have joked about it if Two-Bone was really hurt. He suggested I take tips from the way he treated his own animals, and the llamas stared disapprovingly at me too. Okay, I get it. Two-Bone continued to stand by my side with his usual stupid smile on his face, although ever so more placidly than normal, and I felt shame. I didn't mean to hit you, Two-Bone. I should have ignored the merchant's jibes, but instead tried to impress him by explaining my plans to build a barn for some of the animals in the area, which the merchant appeared to find quite funny. I hadn't got any more emeralds since I'd purchased fish from the merchant, and that was some time ago. I think he knew that, but visited me anyway, either to encourage me to earn more by flouting his wares, which was working, or because he liked my company. He always had something to say, and today he had actually intended to compliment me on my efforts to help the grumpy village. No, they hadn't said anything nice about me, but just gifting me the sword was quite significant. Of all the villages in the area, they were by far the most insular and even secretive, which didn't lend itself to making friends. That said, he added that they weren't happy with me now that others were also referring to them as the grumpy village. Hang on, I hadn't been going around saying that, so who was? He didn't acknowledge my comment, but did say that my name for the great mountain, Welcome Peak, was also being adopted in the area. Exasperated, I squeezed out a gracious farewell. His attempts to playfully antagonise me had worked, and I was determined to prove him wrong next time he came back. When he sees just how much the animals of the dirty slopes enjoy the barn, that will show him. My designs for the barn had been inflated following the merchant's provocations, and I had run out of wood. It was time for another trip to Oak Island. Two-Bone was happy to return to where I had found him, although he seemed happy to do anything, especially since I had been overcompensatory in my fusses to make up for things. When I arrived, my propensity for building was in full flow, and in between gathering wood, I also built a stone hut at the surface entrance to the dock, as well as refurbished down below. I replanted the trees as I went and collected a bunch of apples in the process. I found that some of the foliage remained attached to the other trees, obstructing the sunlight from the saplings and generally looking messy. Climbing up each tree when this occurred was a painstaking job. I had an idea for an easier fix, but would need some iron. I lapped Oak Island 3 times in search of some, but no luck. There was an ominous underwater cave where there might be some, but I didn't see an easy solution to that problem. So, Two-Bone, Nelly and I took the boat and set off to investigate nearby. A great excuse for a little exploration, and I took out my map. As I searched for iron, I came across a number of oddities that captured my attention. One small sandy islet near Oak Island contained a plethora of different flowers. I met a turtle and a donkey, but still no iron. It wasn't until I started heading back towards the mainland that I found some on one of the thin rocky outcrops. Only a single piece, but that was all that I needed. I docked back in my cove and conferred with Nelly to make flint and steel. Knowing what I intended to do with it, she was hesitant, but I assured her nothing would go wrong. In the night, the fire of the foliage illuminated the surrounding area. I only wanted to remove what was needed and tempered the flames by quenching it when it spread too far. That was until I was interrupted. A host of monsters descended on me, maybe attracted by the fire, and before long the flames were out of control. I even became separated from Two-Bone, which then became my priority, and by the time we were reunited, most of the fires had fizzled out, leaving a mangled grove behind. That was when the merchant appeared. I stood sheepishly in the aftermath of my mess, and this time I felt like I deserved the ridicule. The merchant must have seen the fire from miles off. His mockery was always delivered with an air of levity, which on this occasion actually improved my mood. He supposed, correctly, that I wouldn't have the emeralds to purchase some of his saplings. Only after he left did I realise that as big as the fires were, he would have had to have been somewhat close by to notice them. Before heading back home, I replanted the area with saplings and thought about all the clever responses I could have said to the merchant's snide remarks. I fondly surveyed all the iron that was readily available to me on my doorstep, and, without further ado, I got back to my work on the barn. As I fitted the roof, I broke through the top of the hill. The barn had grown a tad bigger than I originally thought, and I had already had to cover the sides of the hill with some of the excavated dirt, in what could only be described as questionable landscaping. The roof, however, was a happy surprise, and a good excuse to let some natural light into my budding sanctuary. With most of the core structure finished, I could turn my attention to the plumbing. Extending the well was easy enough without disturbing the flow to the farmhouse, and I tried to make a water trough so that it couldn't also be used as an extended swimming pool. Whilst waiting for the sand I popped in the furnace to cook, I planted the flowers I'd found on my trip, and built a fence to allow the future residents to safely graze. As I went to add the finishing touches to the barn, I was graced by the merchant's presence once again. I was somewhat stunned to see him again so soon, and jokingly asked him if he was following me. Distracted by his wares, I longingly looked at the things I couldn't have, and again failed to think of a comeback when he told me that someone had to stop me getting into trouble. The merchant had arrived a few moments too early, as I wanted to show him the barn once it was finished. As we spoke about this and that, he chugged down an invisibility potion in the last light of the day. The time for safe building was over, but I was determined. After filling the barn with a stockpile of hay and fitting the plumbing with glass, I was amazed to find a cow had just waltzed in, like their new home was ready for inspection. I looked around the room, grinning, almost expecting a round of applause for my success. My shock at finding the cow appear from apparent thin air was followed by a greater shock when 2 creepers also found their way in. Terrified the creepers blast might harm the cow, or the barn, I turned tail and fled. I spent a moment inside the farmhouse to collect myself, but was once again alarmed when I saw Two Bone wandering around outside. After meeting him on the roof of the barn, I found the structure acted as a sort of battlement to the south and east. This was my home, and I would defend it. I scoped out my enemy and chose my first arc of attack, but was swiftly repelled by a horrific sight. A skeleton was riding a spider. Having fled again, I got hold of myself and ventured out. 3rd time lucky, and it was. I duelled the rider before clearing the nearby plains as the sun rose on my homestead. Whilst I had struggled to fight off the monsters, I had lost where the merchant had got to, and looked down in disappointment when I found him and his 2 llamas stuck at the bottom of my farm's irrigation. This wasn't the first time the llamas had got themselves stuck down there, and I wonder if the merchant had had his own struggle that night as he tried to get them out. In the end, that task fell to me, and I begrudgingly started to systematically remove stone to free the encumbered beasts. I could see why this may have been more difficult than last time, when a stray hoof belonging to a frightened cow struck my breastplate. When the merchant, his 2 llamas, and the hefty cow were freed, they all came tumbling down the water flow, with me on the bottom. The merchant's nonchalant demeanour hadn't been dampened by being stuck in my plumbing, and as he surveyed the state of my kitchen, he acted as if I was the foolish one for not releasing them sooner. I couldn't help but grin. Under different circumstances, I might have made him dinner. Fish's graceful strokes seemed ever so slightly more skittish in the presence of the hullabaloo caused by the herd of 3 that was crashing around the basement. At least none of them decided to take a drink from her pool, and I think she was probably relieved when the merchant announced it was time for him to depart. But before he did, I noticed him admire Fish's home. Unfortunately, the merchant's exit was blocked by the alarmed cow, who refused to step outside. We spent all day trying to coax the animal, but the cow appeared unable to leave the safety of the farmhouse, and the merchant rightly pointed out that we couldn't just leave it here. I tried to calm the cow. It's okay, we're safe. The cow just stood shivering. When the merchant suggested that the monsters could take the same route we'd entered the kitchen, the cow started to panic again. I took a deep breath and collected my thoughts, in part to stop myself glaring at him. But he was right. Even after replacing the iron bars, I didn't fancy having to remove a creeper if it ended up on the other side. I had an idea. I think the merchant was impressed when I took to knocking down my kitchen wall. I must have appeared to be very committed to helping this cow. If I had measured correctly, I should be right next to the wall of the barn. The far braver cow greeted me as I broke through. I had spent all night finding my way through to the barn, and it was time for the merchant to properly depart my company. He acknowledged that maybe I had more of an affinity with animals than he originally thought, and as he turned to leave, he gifted me a lead. I soon realised that also meant I had the gift of babysitting the llamas for a few days until he collected them. It seems I had provided the merchant with a microcosm of adventure, and I think he enjoyed it. Even though he always found a way to get under my skin, I was grateful for his camaraderie since the fire. For now, though, I wasn't lacking for company, as Poof and Shudder had moved in, although one was more respectful than the other. Shudder still refused to leave the farmhouse, and it seemed Fish would have to get used to her new bunkmate. was curious to visit some of the other villages in the area. Aside from the Grumpy village, I knew about 2 others. I wouldn't say I was angry at the merchant for spreading rumours on his travels, and to be honest, I didn't even know if he had. But if it's possible to find a productive way to channel your angst, it's good to take it. That's what I thought, at least, as I batted away the horde of zombies on the roof of the barn. Anyway, where was I? Yes, it would be good to reach out to the other villages. If anything, to give them some idea of who I was. I hoped they'd be friendly. I had never seen so much equipment intact after fighting zombies before, although I don't think I'd ever fought that many either. It was a shame that everything they had dropped looked like it was falling apart. I'd sensed some magic emanating from the gold leggings and the leather boots, which was confirmed as Nellie lightly glowed in their presence. For the time being, I squirreled them away. I was shocked when I found out Nellie didn't know how to make the chainmail boots, and I teased her lightly for it. I told Nellie I didn't want them anyway, and into the chest they went. For the upcoming journey, some new boots would be useful though. There were a few bits of housekeeping to take care of before I departed. I had found fish hiding in the kelp when Shudder was taking a particularly loud bath. Again, I tried to lure Shudder to join Poof in the barn. Even with the temptation of a bushel of wheat, he preferred the comfort of indoors. Poof was looking at Shudder like he was an idiot, although I was also receiving a very similar look. I probably shouldn't have spoiled Shudder with his own bedroom inside, but I couldn't just leave him with no food. To my knowledge, he hadn't figured out how to open the chests in the kitchen, and I didn't fancy his chances. Shudder made Two Bone seem like a genius. At times. Nellie had no objections either, and was beaming when I learnt how to make carpets. With that, I had said my goodbyes. On my way to Copperwater Cave, I traversed down the gravelly cliffs to the boat, along the coast under the rocky plateau, where I was joined by 2 dolphins, all the while bypassing the dirty slopes. The lava waterfall marked the mouth of the small river where Copperwater Cave nestled. Once there, it wasn't far to the nearby farming village. When I arrived, all the villagers were running for cover. I suppose there was a light rain. Previously they had been very welcoming here, but at this time they weren't even sparing me a moment's glance. A flash of lightning put things into perspective for me, and it wasn't long before the monsters started to emerge. I held my sword aloft as thunder filled the sky, and I prepared for combat with some food, and rotten flesh for Two Bone close to hand. That was a good thing too, as I ended up needing plenty of it. Two Bone guarded me like his own life depended on it, and together we repelled the handful of monsters that found their way to the surface. In the night, I caught a far-off Enderman watching me. I was close to holding out the rest of the storm in a nearby cave when the rain abruptly stopped and the air cleared. In the relative peace, I found the Enderman and was happy to learn it was in fact Guest. It was very difficult to tell without their imparted visions. We stood together as the sun rose on the farming village, and its beauty took me aback somewhat. I was dragged out of that moment when Guest commandeered my senses to show me bread. This wasn't the first time they'd asked me for food, and if it wasn't for the sudden shift out of the induced euphoria, it wouldn't bother me one bit. Readjusting to reality, I offered them some of mine, but they only looked at it before looking back at me. Fine, don't have any. Maybe I had misinterpreted what they were trying to say. In the crisp morning, I met some of the locals. They were glad to welcome me to their home and told me it was called Lashville. They remembered who I was, And perhaps that's why they were so quick to tell me the name of their village, before I made one up for them. I hoped I hadn't inappropriately earned a reputation as a gossip, although from the way word was spreading around town, that might be helping me fit in. Some of them had seen me fighting off monsters in the night, and one of them was even excited that they got to watch me in action. Their friendliness extended to their willingness to trade, but I was still without any emeralds to purchase anything. The difference was this time, I made a note of all the things they might be willing to buy off me. As usual, when I wrote anything down in Nellie's pages, it soon disappeared, but she would remember. The villagers were very interested in purchasing potatoes, which was a shame because I wasn't growing any back at the homestead. Despite their own successful efforts to grow wheat, one of the farmers said that they could never have enough and would buy some of that too. Not wanting to ignore the kindness I had been shown, with their permission, I spent a little time fixing up the toolsmith's workshop, to which she was immensely grateful. After the day's labours, we gathered in the village square and merrily chatted. I wondered where everyone was, as despite the village's size, it seemed quite sparsely populated. The mood shifted slightly, and they told me between the illager and monster attacks, they were all that was left. The silence was broken as one of the farmers said that it looked like I was talking to an enderman this morning. The toolsmith interjected, asking him if I looked like the sort that would fraternise with monsters. I didn't say anything, but that still felt like a lie. Changing the subject, I asked if I could store some things here before I set off. They gave me one better and said I should stay the night. Before bed, I popped some odds and ends I didn't need in one of their chests and noticed some leather in there too. I also had a quick look at an anvil and a brewery stand, the latter being a complete mystery to me. As I got myself comfortable in one of their spare huts, I couldn't help but beam at Nellie and Two-Bone following the lovely day I'd had here. That night, I had dreamed of the vision of bread that Guest had shown me, and in the morning, I think I knew what they were trying to tell me. I gifted the villagers with some of my homemade bread as a goodbye present, to which they were very receptive. When I told them I was planning to visit the other village just over the squat mountain, they gave each other a look and asked me if I was sure I wanted to go there. It seems they didn't get on. As I trudged through the slosh, I thought about the nurturing rain that must have helped to give this place its name. I could barely see my next destination through the clouds and fog, but the faint glow of torches and Lashville's parting sentiments told me I hadn't imagined it last time I was here. On this occasion, I was much better prepared. The dense rain and fog had slowed me down. Before I spotted the third village I was to visit, I'd walked around in circles for a while. With it now painted onto my map, I hopefully wouldn't have that problem again. Monsters surrounded the town, and when my shield shattered, I was unable to continue fighting and escaped by the skin of my teeth. I sought shelter in the first hut I came across, and fortunately it was empty. I didn't fancy having to explain what I was doing to a startled villager. After recuperating, I spent the night in a cave that lay just within the town. In the morning, I found a villager trapped in a rock pool with a hideously bloated zombie. Without hesitation, Two-Bone and I set to their rescue. My fervour was riled up by the villager, who was shouting "Stop!" and "Get away!" at the zombie. After the creature was slain, I turned to humbly accept their thanks, but instead received an angry lecture. They'd been shouting at me. The cleric had been studying the drowned, a variant of zombie. Where was he going to find another one? I shuffled my feet and looked down as he pointed out the damage I'd done to one of their holy rock pools, as well as the wishing well cave I'd defiled by sleeping there. The cleric had almost banished me from the town on the spot, but after following him back to his alchemy lab, I tried to explain myself, and he begrudgingly pointed me towards the upper tier of the town, where I could find their mare. I left just before the cleric figured out I had trespassed during the night. Heading up through the tunnel I had vandalised, I found the surface entrance guarded by an iron golem, who stared at me as I edged past. The mayor was in her office, although she dismissed the idea that she was mayor, just someone the people of Old Cartton looked up to. She introduced herself as Gloria and apologised for the cleric's behaviour, asking me to please have patience with Phineas, he's easily antagonised. She was very civil and introduced me to some of the other villagers. I asked her about the town and was surprised at how knowledgeable she was. Once upon a time, these lands were far more built up and populated, but most evidence of the civilizations were lost without a trace. Even most of the sturdy ancient architecture has since been reduced to dust. This town has always been independent, even when much of these lands were owned by one large belligerent country. I asked how they know these things. Gloria told me there were very few surviving records, but a lot can be gleaned from ancient maps. With the light of the day fading, she allowed me to stay here. I had no choice but to sleep in the Wishing Well cave again. When I interrupted his conversation with Gloria, I avoided Phineas's gaze. He had been complaining about me. She asked if, whilst I was staying here, I could refrain from sleeping in the Wishing Well, and this time it was my turn to apologise. After I explained there was no spare beds for me to sleep in, she gave me planning permission to erect a house there. Judging from the way she reassured me, the look on my face revealed my surprise. She told me Old Carlton held their traditions dear, which shouldn't be so set in their ways that they never build anything ever again. Just don't make anything that stands out too much. I may have been a bit ambitious in my attempts to befriend Phineas. He really disliked me, but let me finish when I offered to replace his drowned test subject. He scoffed at my plan to extend his laboratory, but when I described my ideas for the design, he paused in thought and agreed to let me try. Although his parting remarks conveyed his lack of confidence in me and the promise of unspecified retribution should I ruin his existing lab. I was going to need acacia, iron, glass, and a little ingenuity. My closest source of acacia was on the lower tier of the mountain to the east of Old Carlton, called Mount Portley, because it looked just as wide as it did tall. The small water-clogged cave the cleric called a wishing well laid underneath, with a curtain of water at its entrance. I had found that I was able to swim up the waterfall there just as easily as I swam in the river. It was on Mount Portley that I spent the next week, each day ascending the flowing water by the wishing well and gathering acacia across its shallow slope. Atop there was ample iron and coal to be collected, as well as a few emeralds, and on the south-east side there was a grove of oak trees. I had gotten the sand a short ways up the thin lake that encircled Mount Portley on its northern half. Old Carlton sat on the lake, and you could set sail from either one of its piers. I collapsed into the blissful repetition of chopping and mining, so building progress was slow to begin with. On the first night out of the wishing well, I slept under the stars in the foundations I was working on. The night after, Phineas came to inspect the structure, and even had the audacity to rest in my bed. He watched as I constructed the roof over him, and even with the racket of the construction, he had gotten more sleep than I had. Phineas seemed to enjoy taking my bed, and continued to do so. Not rising to the bait, I once again slept under the stars, only this time on the roof. I wonder if Gloria knew what he was doing. I had caught Phineas telling another of the villagers that they were welcome to use his bed again. The cleric's kindness struck me as odd, and apparently the weaponsmith had noticed too. Phineas saw me approach and hesitated answering the weaponsmith when she asked him where he would sleep. I let Phineas awkwardly mutter a feigned response before turning to the weaponsmith myself to ask how they planned to repair their iron golem. With iron? The weaponsmith's blunt reply was somewhat helpful, and it didn't seem like she was trying to patronise me, but Phineas's scoff showed he clearly thought that it was obvious. The weaponsmith explained that she hadn't got around to it yet. Despite the success of Old Cartton, the historical town was burdened with disrepair, and it struck me that I could help by at least making sure there were enough beds to go round. I extended the structure to have a second floor, and on the ground floor also built a small boathouse. In between building, I pottered around town. One night, a zombie walked straight into the square, but I defended the townsfolk before anyone got hurt. On another day, with Nellie's help, I fixed up the golem, so when I left, the hulking sentry could deal with the monsters. My efforts there went some ways to helping improve my standing with the locals, but Gloria's decision to allow me to build here wasn't popular. Whilst I was proud of the monster prison I'd built in Phineas's new laboratory basement, and my successful attempt to trap a drowned down there, that also wasn't popular. It seemed Phineas's experiments were poorly tolerated, and many here had been relieved when his original test subject was killed. I realised that the villagers likely thought that Gloria had allowed me to extend the lab too. Phineas wasn't around when the lab extension was completed, and I found him sneaking off towards the Wishing Well cave. I wonder what he was doing. I sold some coal to the weaponsmith and bought redstone off Phineas. I knew he'd given me unfavourable terms, but I had hoped that by engaging in trade, the villagers might come round to me. The weaponsmith at least was grateful, in part because I had already relieved her from fixing the golem. Feeling guilty for betraying Gloria's trust, I sailed to the nearby jungle to pick some sugarcane and replanted it in town. I wasn't around long enough to process it into paper, however, as after some tweaks here and there, and fitting the tight barracks with beds, the structure was complete and I was ready to leave. I had stayed here for quite some time and was worried I had far since outstayed my welcome. It seems my suspicions were correct, as the townsfolk acted ambivalently when I said goodbye, despite the help I'd offered. Rather than being grateful, Phineas was gleeful that he had managed to get so much out of me. And it may have been his comments that had soured some of the other villagers towards me. Perhaps he was trying to elevate his own standing by pulling me down. I tried idle pleasantries to leave the townsfolk with a good impression, but that ended up being the final straw when I told them I preferred the weather here than in Lashville. Simply associating myself with their neighbouring town was apparently an insult. I wasn't looking forward to facing Gloria again, but found she had a more nuanced outlook to my visit. I thanked her for her hospitality, and she thanked me for my help, also adding that, in future constructions here, I could make terracotta out of clay. I wanted to ask more about why Old Cartton and Lashville didn't get on, but thought it best not to push my luck. I started to explain myself for imprisoning a dangerous zombie within the town, but she interrupted me and smiled. The merchant was right about you. I knew he'd been gossiping. I headed back, climbing over Mount Portley, and instead of setting sail from Copperwater Cave, decided to follow my old waypoints to navigate the dirty slopes. My trip to Lashville and Old Cartton had left me on marginally better standings than the complete neutrality I'd begun with, and I'd learnt that I was able to sell paper to Gloria and her assistant, coal to the weaponsmith, zombie flesh to Phineas, and various foodstuffs in Lashville. But for now, I was glad to be home. These compilations are pretty simple to put together. There's not too much I can do about the audio as it's taken from the original mix, so apologies if the levels are a bit out of whack between chapters. What I have changed though is I've removed the end from in between each chapter. They really needn't be there since the story is far from over. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed.